Hello. All right, let's get into it. I'm going to cut it a little early today and get started so we can basically get to the show. My name is Bret, and if you haven't been here before, this is something I do every week. And I live stream, and I answer questions, and sometimes we have guests, and sometimes we talk about things. So if you haven't been here before, the format here is we're asking questions, you line them up in a row and chat. Maybe they're course related, maybe they're not in some of my courses. I have a bunch of news I'm going to go through, and then we're going to roll into questions. I only have an hour today, so unlike sometimes where we're hanging out for 2 or 3 hours, we're going to cram all this in 1 hour as much as we can. So to make sure you get your questions answered, I thought I would just jump right in. And to heck with that whole long intro thing. So today I've got some news I'm going to go through. First off, thank you so much for patrons. You are greatly appreciated. So in case you didn't know, you can go to patreon.com/Bret Fisher, and these are the people that sponsor this show. The people that are basically buying me a coffee every month. You don't have to pay me anything. You don't have to give me any money. If you would like to get updates, which are about once a week, and if you scroll down and click the follow button, you can follow me there, get basically notified in the app or an email when I've done something in open source, when I've got a course update, or when I've got a guest on the live show or something like that's happening. So it's very low traffic, and it's basically the best way to just keep up to date with what I'm doing. All right, next up, in case you didn't know, there's these little links at the top of the screen. DevOps.fan is our Discord server. I think we're just about to hit 5,000 members, so that's very exciting. And this is where we talk about everything container DevOps. So come hang out in the channels, and this is also where you can get other people to help you, hopefully, with any of the course issues. So people are sometimes in there at odd hours when I'm not around, and can help you in the courses through the text channels down here. So we've got course help, for all the different courses and all that stuff. So that's there. A big announcement this week that I started putting out in social media, and you'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks, is that all 4 of my courses are now supported across not just Intel, which is the standard things, Intel processors, but it's now supported on Apple M1s, which are running an ARM64, basically ARM v8 processor, and then ARM v7, which is largely used in Raspberry Pis. This also means you can now do the course on Graviton ARM instances, which are in AWS in the cloud, And I just saw news today, actually, that Oracle's got their own ARM instances, and I suspect that all the other cloud people will follow, as well as eventually we will probably start to see more and more laptops using Windows on ARM, or actually I think it's called Windows 10 on ARM or something like that. So ideally, the course is supported on all these platforms. And before, some of the stuff would work, some of the stuff wouldn't. It wasn't well tested. So I went through, we updated dozens of images and repos all over the place. And there's a couple of little things, just edge cases, but those are all noted in the source code or in the course or somewhere where it'll be obvious that a particular thing you're about to try may not work if you're not on Intel, because not everything out there, I'm looking at you, Java, not everything out there is well supported on all the platforms. So Java is one of the more difficult ones. Sometimes databases are only supported on Intel. So it just depends on what they are. And yeah, so that's been months of work. All right. The next thing is, some of these are links that are coming from the Discord chat. So if you're not in Discord, definitely go check that out. So many good people put in relevant links throughout the week. And I'm going to start covering a couple of those that I think are particularly exceptional, calling them out. This one, the Cloud Girl, this is from a DevRel person at Google that is making fantastic art that is all related to the Google Cloud and how some of their services work. So I'm putting that into chat. That's the cloudgirl.dev. She also has a great Twitter account where she shares all this stuff, so you can see that stuff. But in case you're curious about the creative way to describe, and this is the thing, is as an educator, I love it when people have more creative ways to describe what's going on. So like cloud load balancing, right? This is just like this crazy graphic with a whole lot going on. I think I really appreciate it. There are other people doing stuff like this in the world, and I think we need more of it. And it makes me wish I could draw better. So there's that. Next up in the news is registration is now open if you for KubeCon North America in October. I'm planning on going. So if you're going, definitely reach out to me when we get close to the event. Show up in the Discord chat, and maybe we'll make a room in there for anyone who's going to be on site. I'm not sure how many people are going to be able to go internationally, but because we have so many people now vaccinated in the United States, the registration for real world events is finally happening. Of course, in order to go, you need to have proof of vaccination, which is a good thing. And I'm going to hopefully get the early bird pricing there. So yeah, needed to show that on the screen. So not sure if I was showing this a while ago. The load balancing, this was the thing I was trying to show a while ago. May not have been putting that on the screen. But anyway, these are that's the art from the Cloud Girl. And then, KubeCon registration is up for North America. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm really curious to see how many international people are able to get in, because it may be hard to get in with travel and stuff. So it might just be a U.S. or North America only event. All right, next up in the news, Docker has sort of pre-released their Docker dev environment. So this is a feature I've mentioned several times throughout the year because they've had early beta, early alpha releases, and then they announced it and showed it off at DockerCon, which is essentially, at first I didn't get it. I didn't actually get what this was about. I didn't see how I would use it. Didn't quite make sense to me. But if you're working in a team, a lot of what a team ends up doing is, if I'm working on, a pull request, and I'm in a branch, or maybe I'm in a fork on my own branch and my own repo, and we're all working on different features, right? And maybe you want to put in the PR, hey, everybody go check out my, code. And people tend to review code in a team, right? They'll review the PR. But in order to run that code, you usually either need to stop what you're doing in Git. It becomes a big Git exercise, right? So you stop what you're doing in Git. You usually have to stash your current code, jump over to a branch, pull the latest branches, go over to their branch, and spin everything back up. You might need to fill in the database, like basically empty out the database and repopulate with their sample code if they're changing database schemas and stuff like that. So it gets really tedious to just shift your environment to maybe run someone else's environment. it interrupts your flow because you have to completely stop what you're doing and prepare for theirs. Obviously, sometimes you can always just re-clone the repo and then go to their branch and do it, but you're still doing a lot of the same work, right? So it's a big exercise in Git. So Docker had an idea early this year, and the captains gave them a lot of feedback around making sure that, one, we're not trying to replace your Git workflow. Like, this isn't meant to replace branching and forking and PRs, like all these things that we're normally doing. What this is meant to do is to give you another option for how to quickly jump in essentially to someone else's code they've put into Git. So, or they may have not put into Git. So one of the cool things that this can do is it can wrap up your local environment, including your compose file and everything you're doing in it, as well as the source code and other things, wrap it all up into images, store that temporarily on Docker Hub, and then allow you to share that with your team members using a short URL, like an automated generator. Right now, it's not all the features aren't quite there, so it doesn't have the automated URL thing yet. But the vision here is that you'll be able to send somebody a URL, they'll throw it into Docker Desktop. It will then download the images, which essentially will have the source code that you would normally be keeping in Git, but it will allow an easier way for you to just run something without touching your current environment or how you're developing, run it, play with it, and see the changes that they might be making, and then just throw it away and not have to then switch back to your setup. You can technically leave your whole setup running, run this in parallel. They give you a couple of screenshots of how this whole workflow works. I plan, once this feature gets closer to release, I plan to do a whole show on this and hopefully have some experts on to talk about different ways to use this. But I think this is a pretty interesting way of sharing code that's not just posting it in, posting it in a separate Git repo or posting snippets on, regular snippet websites. Like, that's obviously not going to scale to a lot of things. So we haven't had really anyone trying to do this other than maybe you're sharing screen or pairing or other stuff. And this is not that, right? This is not you jumping into their machine. This is simply using Docker Hub as a way to temporarily store source code and other things in images as a way to transfer it from one other team member to you in a private manner. So that's the nice thing, is it'll be in private temporary URLs that you won't necessarily have in a public account. Now, the question remains around, do you need a paid account? Like, what parts of this require a paid account? They're inventing a couple of other ideas, like putting a compose file inside of a .docker folder, and that's what's being automatically spun up. And they've even got some demos that you can run without even using your own code if you want. If you just jump into Docker Desktop, there will be a demo in there under dev environments that you can run to see kind of how it works. But there's a lot to unpack here. I hope to have more of that in a future episode. So stay tuned. All right, another Docker captain, Brian Christner, was pointing out this morning that a popular thread on Hacker News today, or at least this week, but probably just today. Yeah, I think this was 12 hours ago. Was someone who essentially put a Docker-based Mongo database on a server and was relying solely on the server firewall for the protection from the internet. And basically was surprised when Docker more or less rewrites firewall rules, or the way it uses the built-in IP tables firewall rules of Linux may not gel well with your own management of firewall, regardless of what firewall tool you're using. So it's a great discussion. I'm actually going to post all of this in the chat. Let me actually put the Docker blog post in first. And then this Hacker News article I'll put in. And what I ended up doing was I read a lot of the top comments, and then I just started searching for Docker to see what people were talking about Docker in terms of how Docker manipulates IP tables, because this is something that, if you really dive into Docker, you've known about for years, and how it uses IP tables and the pros and cons of how it uses IP tables. And it's, to a lot of us that have been using Docker a long time, it's just sort of a known entity that you really shouldn't rely on the local firewall when you're using Docker. And that doesn't mean that Docker networks are insecure. But if you publish a port in Docker, it will be exposed on the host. Like it will be there. You will need to do a whole lot of extra things if you wanted to use then a host firewall in addition to that to lock that port down somehow. And so a lot of us in the distributed computing world, we no longer really rely on host firewalls. In fact, I can't remember the last time I worked with a client even in the cloud or in distributed computing that relied on host firewalls at all. There's a couple of things that tend to happen there. One is they tend to fail silently. So like, in other words, they're not blocking protocols and technology, and you don't know that unless you have in-depth local analyzers on each host. Hosts seem to be, we tend to treat hosts very temporarily, like they're ephemeral. So thus their firewalls can't really be relied upon unless you're automatically spinning those up. So we all tend to use the security built into the cloud. And when you're in a physical network in a maybe a hybrid scenario or just in your own private cloud, then you usually have higher level tools, load balancers, and VLANs and other things that are all providing the filtering and the network protection, right? That's a long way of going around the argument of that Docker doesn't let me use my firewall and Docker breaks the firewall that goes around it. And that's technically true. Docker uses a part of IP tables that will largely be ignored by your default firewall rules. And that's not necessarily Docker's fault. It is a little bit by design because of the way that container tools all kind of tend to do this, right? Docker's not the only one that does this. So containers, if you think back way back in the day, like when we first started, one of the things that Docker wanted to do was it wanted to provide a very easy way for developers or people that are not operating in sysadmin experts to run applications securely and repeatably, like the same thing over and over again. That's where we got the container image from. But when it came to running it, we didn't want people to have to mess around with a host firewall and have to do other things in order to protect the machine. That's why when you install Docker by default, it does not open up any ports by default. There's nothing open. You can't connect to Docker remotely. It's basically all running internal. And when you create containers on a Docker network, they can talk to each other, but nothing from outside the host can talk into those containers by default. And if you expose ports between them, which it now does by default in the little private networks, those two containers on that network can still talk to each other. So it allowed us to do all of that, right? But when you decided to do the -p and publish a port, it would then publish it on the host, and it technically goes through NAT. So it goes through address translation in the background. So it's translating from that host IP to this fake IP that Docker's creating in all these little networks, right? Well, due to the various natures and limits of the firewall technology, this ultimately means that traffic coming in on that published port will be ignored by other firewalls also on the system. And we can go back and look at all the design reasons on why that happened, but that's how it works today. And it hasn't changed since really the dawn of Docker. So people that are new to Docker or did not realize this, and then they go ahead and they implement an additional host firewall, and then they think it's locked down, will be unpleasantly surprised. They will be surprised to know that in most cases, unless they really know what they're doing and they specify very specific things inside of either the Docker configuration itself to turn off its IP tables manipulation, or they use host networking where they basically disable all Docker networking altogether and they only rely on a host firewall, or there are some tools and techniques out there where you can kind of change the order of rules and do things in IP tables. Ultimately, this all means that you really have to know local host firewalls and you really have to know IP tables. And when you do that, you are taking control. So that means you need to be the one to test and validate that your host is not exposing ports. Well, unfortunately, we all make mistakes, and I've made plenty of production horrible mistakes before. And unfortunately, this particular person did not test that. They did not validate that their firewall was working. They also did not put a password on their database or any other mechanism of protection. And so they relied solely on the host firewall, which was being ignored by Docker. And basically, it's ignored by IP tables in the way that it's doing NAT for Docker. And so they unfortunately got hacked. Well, luckily they have backups, which is going to protect them. But one of the good things that I learned about in this article was some of the other ways you can manipulate Docker and local firewalls if you run into this case. Now, I am personally, and most of the people I work with, not a fan of host firewalls anymore because we just can't rely on them in a world where we're spinning up and down machines, maybe on a daily basis, maybe on an hourly basis. And we need to rely on other layers like network layers and VLANs and all the other things that the cloud and other tools provide. And that the host firewall, while it can be effective, can also be problematic because especially once you get into the Kubernetes world and you're using network policies and other things, you really don't want yet another layer of control beyond the ones that already exist. So host firewalls may, in that case, actually do you harm because you may break things by going into each individual host. To me, host firewalls made sense back when we were all managing enough machines that we could name them and remember them, right? When we all had just a few machines. But now when we have dozens, if not hundreds of servers to manage per person, or even thousands, it's really hard to individually manage the firewalls unless you're in a very automated specific setup. So my advice to you, I know this is kind of a rant, but my advice to you, one, if you're interested in more of this topic, if you want to dive in, sudo B Mitch is talking about the Docker user table. Yep. And so that's a part of the IP tables that Docker does its thing. And if you've never really dug into that stuff, you don't necessarily have to, but just, if you're not going to dive into deeper firewall technology of Linux, just assume, one, that there isn't one. Just assume that there's not. And that putting ports and exposing them, and when I say expose in Docker, what I mean is the publish option. Lots of other applications will manipulate IP tables, cause problems with firewalls. And so unless you're intimately aware of all of them, don't rely on firewalls on a specific machine to be your only source of protection. You got to password protect all your databases. You need to probably have load balancers that are the only things that are exposed to the internet. And a lot of people talk about all this great stuff in this Hacker News article. So I would advise you to check that out. I have highlighted an option here. I'll put this link in here. This particular person put in some really interesting details about other ways you might be able to solve this problem. And really, this is in the case where someone has one or two servers, they don't have, for whatever reason, a load balancer or a network layer firewall in front of them. So their hosts are right on the open internet, and they maybe want to filter incoming traffic to the host based on IP addresses or something like that, right? I again think that most of those use cases are gone. But then again, we all do things differently, and everyone has different use cases. So I don't remember the last time I actually saw one of my clients using a host firewall because we had all these other layers of protection now. So anyway, this is actually a really great list. And then what I will point you to is what I guess is probably the most up-to-date Docker issue on this subject. There's lots of people over the years that have talked about Docker and firewalls, wishing that Docker would implement their own firewall or manage the firewall in a way that's different than what it currently does. And so there's lots of opinions out there. And largely at this point, it's going to depend on open source contributions, which evidently in this case are going to be hard to come by because you have to be a Docker expert, you have to be an IP tables expert. And then you have to be willing to do, commit to open source and follow, all of the rules and regulations around large projects like Docker, which, can be a little bit difficult. And then you have to know Golang and a lot of other things. So the number of people that could contribute to this problem are limited, but this is a really interesting issue rather. And you can see that it's actually still being discussed 5 years later about potential solutions and options all the way down here at the bottom. And you still got maintainers in there that are trying to manage the conversation. So it's not as if this is a done deal and we're never going to see enhancements to Docker's management of firewall rules. But I think all of us that have been using Docker for 5-7 years, we have basically gotten used to this. We understand that when you publish a port, it will be exposed on the host and it will be on the network that the machine is on, and that you need other things, whether it's Kubernetes or load balancers or, network security policies or all these different things, depending on where you're running this. Those are the things that we put in place to protect our machines, not necessarily the host firewall itself. All right. So that is all the news I have for today. And yeah, I think that's it. All right, let's get to some questions. Hello, everyone, by the way. Hello. Brett asks, Nginx reverse proxy, how to get the real client IP address? That depends on how you're running Nginx, Brett. If you're talking about web ports, then you're going to want to look at headers, and you're going to want to look into, basically, there's multiple different headers in the HTTP packets that will address your problem. And it totally depends on how you're running Nginx. Is there anything in front of Nginx? Is Nginx in Docker? Is it in Swarm? Is it in Kubernetes? Do you have a network load balancer in front of it? And yeah, that can get pretty complicated, right? So there's all of that. But largely, it's going to end up you needing to pass headers from all the way from the front load balancer, wherever that's at, back to your Nginx, and then you're going to need to write Nginx rules that deal with your host header in a way that however you need to get that IP address. In most environments nowadays, it is extremely rare for the actual Nginx or application itself for that IP address, especially in container world where everything's a fake address. It's really rare for those to have direct access to the incoming IP. There ends up being always layers of natting and load balancers all the way down the stack. So I would say that you have to kind of invest time in learning about, host headers and proxy and how the proxies pass IPs throughout their stack, because ultimately you're never going to be able to get that utopia scenario of like the application that needs to manage my IP address is directly on the internet without changing IP addresses, without natting. Like that's really rare nowadays. So good question though. Ian's got a question. Would you recommend building apps and creating images for deployment actually inside containers themselves, or really is the idea to build stuff on the host and then build containers for deployments? It depends on your thinking. So I tend to prefer development inside of containers. So my code is on my host OS. I'm bind mounting that code into the container, and the container is running all my dependencies and the application itself, right? And so I'm changing source code on the host, and then it's automatically seeing the changes in the container. That's how I tend to operate. That is also because I work with lots of people and lots of different products, so I'm constantly changing Node versions and changing from Python to Go to Node to to PHP to Ruby. So I'm all over the place depending on who I'm working with, and so it's very hard for me to ever manage a consistent environment. If you're someone you're only working on one project, you have a well-defined Docker file that you can test locally. You can build it and test it locally, so you trust that process. But when you're developing, you'd rather use just Visual Studio Code and all of its built-in technology, and you would rather not have to have Docker running. That's fine. I see teams that do that every day. Teams that are much more comfortable in how their environment is built, and their environment has all internal dependencies. And what I mean by that is, if you're using Golang, for example, Go modules are all there. They're a part of the application. You define them there. You typically don't need external dependencies installed by some other package manager, hopefully. If you are in Node, Node has NPM, and hopefully you don't also need some other package manager like apt or yum or whatever, right? That you're doing everything in NPM so that the NPM install installs everything. So the reason I say that is because when you have a single package manager like that, they can usually be scoped to your current directory and then it's a sane management of your dependency workflow, right? So all it's a matter in Node is to make sure you have this similar Node version, and you pin all your packages in your package JSON file. And so when you do an npm install on your local host, it's pretty close to what your Docker file is going to do. And then maybe later you build your Docker file locally and you do a test inside your Docker file. You could totally do that. I see teams that do that all the time. The teams that I tend to recommend container first development are those where it's a very large team and their Docker file is quite complex. I'm talking hundreds of lines, because the way, and most of these are legacy applications, the way that this application gets installed and configured requires many different commands, requires apt or yum or host-based installation tools, as well as things like maybe bundler or composer or and plus npm and something else. And you end up with all these different package managers adding layers and layers of complexity. And then you maybe need to build assets that are not necessarily built into your file watching, like NodeMon or something like that, or your when they get really complex like that, it becomes hard for any one developer to understand exactly how everything's installed. They couldn't build it from scratch themselves, so they have to rely on the Docker file and the local developer environment in Docker to provide them that, because they didn't ever understand the entire process before. So my preference is that everything that you build is as simple as you can make it, so that just because there's another package manager that has a neat tool that you might want to use doesn't mean you should do that, right? That you keep if your Docker file is over 50 lines, there's probably room for you to optimize your applications so that they are simpler to install, simpler to deploy, simpler to configure. And that work is necessary, especially when we're in the world of spinning up new apps everywhere and spinning up servers all over the place. And, someone over here is nowadays we're going to have, pretty soon you're going to have issues where you got two people on the same team and one's on an ARM machine and one's on an Intel machine, and they're both trying to develop the same application on two different processors. That's not been possible in a very easy manner until very, very recently. And in order to do that, you're going to need to know more about platforms and doing multi-platform building, multi-architecture builds of your applications. And that all requires knowledge that a lot of developers just haven't had before. They haven't had to worry about anything other than just build, and it works. And they never thought about the fact that their machine might be a different architecture or platform than the server they're running on. And that world is coming to fruition very, very quickly. So the simpler your apps are, the simpler your Docker file is, I would say that the better your app is going to be. And if you're in 100, maybe even 200 lines in your compose file, this is pretty common, not in compose file, but Docker file. This is pretty common for things like PHP and Ruby and Python. Particularly PHP and Ruby, which tend to be web apps that tend to rely on host package managers plus their package manager, plus usually a little bit of NPM sprinkled in, and then maybe some gulp and other stuff at the very tail of it all. And this just makes it really complicated to get your app set up correctly and then to deploy it correctly. So if you look at the modern languages, the more modern ones like Node.js, which I would argue isn't even as modern as something like Golang, maybe Rust, you'll start to see that these concerns these are concerns that are now in the forefront of the way you build your apps. When you go to distributed computing and you're now not just deploying one app, but many, many apps, dozens of apps potentially, if you're doing something like microservices or just distributed, you'll notice that configuration and installation of your app, configuration of that app, building of that app becomes a number one primary concern, because you don't want to have complicated, horrible, long setups across dozens of containers, right? So anyway, that's a soapbox, but great question. That's a great question. The long answer is it depends. Nari, Docker interview questions. Well, I would think that out of the box, you probably should have some open source on GitHub showing off how you use Docker. I mean, if you're going to get a job and you're going to be using containers in that job, you probably These are all tools that are living in an open source world. So your GitHub profile should not be empty. And you should probably show off some things you're learning, some things you're doing. You should probably have some of your own Docker files and compose files that you can show. I mean, nothing's better than in an interview walking in and saying, "Oh no, you want to talk about this thing? Well, I've got some stuff on GitHub. Let's go look at it." If you want to get a job in DevOps, you probably should have some Terraform in your GitHub. You probably should have some, maybe some Ansible, maybe some CloudFormation. If you want to get fancy, you don't have to have all that stuff, but you definitely should have some Kubernetes manifests and some Docker files and compose files, right? You want to have a lot of that stuff. And then you want to set up your own CI for your own open source software. And then you can show off to the team in your interview. You can say, look, I've got my own little simple, I've got a version of this web app that I like, and I just made it in open source, and I just forked it, and now I'm doing testing in GitHub Actions, and you can do all this for free, right? So there's not really a reason to not have it. And then what'll probably happen is, you may not realize this, but before you ever have that interview, before you've even been into the interview room, there's probably someone in that room that's already looked you up online. They've probably looked up to see if you have a GitHub profile, if you even do any commits into open or private source on GitHub. And so that would be what I would do. If I was going to interview you for a DevOps or developer job, I'd be looking you up on LinkedIn. I'd be looking you up on GitHub, maybe on Twitter as well, but mostly GitHub and LinkedIn. GitHub is where I'm going to find whether or not you are involved in the open source community, or if you are learning anything and you're sharing it. Because nowadays, it isn't what you know, it's what you share. That's the biggest thing you can do in a job nowadays, especially with a modern team, is your skill set is great. But if you're keeping it to yourself, your team isn't benefiting from you near as much as if you share it. And one of the ways you can share is with open source. So I would recommend you do that first. Have a bunch of Docker files in there that you've tried out, have them all in the same repo, make it simple, and show off what you've done so that they will see that. And then you might be surprised. You might show up in the room and they might not ask you a lot of Docker questions because they've already seen all the stuff you did on GitHub. They may realize, hey, this person knows Docker. They know Docker Compose. Maybe they know some Kubernetes because you've got some Kubernetes stuff in there. And you will hopefully find that the interview is a little bit easier because they're not so much doubting your skills because they've seen what you're doing in open source. But in terms of questions, you just Google it. Honestly, there's so many resources out there for good questions. You want to know Docker networking. You want to know how to make Docker containers. You want to know, how to scale up multiple Docker instances and have them working together with something like Kubernetes or Swarm. You want to know all that stuff, right? If you're going to be working with Docker. So I'd say play with the things and stop. Don't worry so much about the interview questions themselves. Just learn the tools as best you can. And then if you are still interested, go look up test questions. There's tons of free test question resources out there. Look up interview questions and you'll find a bunch of GitHub repos that already do all that. So good question. Thanks, Nari. Is there a plan for a Podman tutorial? No, honestly. I don't have any customers using it. I don't see a lot of people using it, and it's not a bad tool. It's just there's no one in my world that uses it on a day-to-day basis. So it's there, and I've got a laundry list of other things I want to do first before creating a Podman tutorial. So probably not. I feel like largely to me, in my world, Podman is a tool looking for a problem. I love Docker. I think it works great. I'm in Kubernetes. I'm not going to be using Docker anymore, mostly because I don't need to. I can use Containerd and it's much lighter weight. And and Podman doesn't work with Kubernetes. So to me, Podman, it works on a Linux machine, but not with orchestration, and it doesn't work with my local Mac, right? Like I can't just run it easily like Docker Desktop on my local Mac. So it doesn't have a huge use for me. And so yeah, I don't get a lot of requests for it. So good question though. Yeah, Justin's. Yeah. Yeah, good advice, Justin. Setting the real IP header to X forward. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing is if you already know that much, you already are aware of some of the problems of load balancers and different natting levels, and you just got to make sure that you're passing that from the very front edge where you're doing the first set of NAT. Is programming needed for the DevOps role? If yes, which language would you recommend? Any of those. And I would say it depends on the DevOps role. Say the difference here is that DevOps isn't a specific job, right? So there are lots of people, and companies often will create a DevOps team, and everyone in that team has a different role. So there are people in that team that are more developer oriented, and there's people in that team that are more operator oriented. So I would say if you are someone who's coming into DevOps from ops, then stick with your strength, right? There's lots of people that are needed in DevOps roles that are more on the ops side, that understand sysadmin, like this whole firewall discussion we just had. Like there's people there that need to know that in DevOps sometimes, but a lot of the developers have no idea. So if your strength is in areas like that, then I would say make that your strength. Now, over time, you'll want to learn other things. And so, yes, I would recommend learning a language. Python, Golang, JavaScript. I would not bother with Java. It's not that you're going to use just one language in DevOps, because a lot of DevOps is helping out. You've got one foot in ops and you've got one foot in as a developer. But again, it depends on your role. You might be someone that's labeled DevOps, but your only job is to manage the continuous integration. There are people that are DevOps engineers that really all they do is Jenkins. And so the term DevOps is so broad and so generic that it doesn't really mean anything in terms of day-to-day work tasking. So if you're someone who's not a programmer, just be upfront about that. I personally think that Bash, if you don't do any programming, but you want to get your foot in there so that you're a better, more diverse person as a DevOps engineer, I would say Bash, because Bash is both applicable in the ops world, in the CI world, and in the developer world. Even on the local machine for a developer, Bash scripting, shell scripting, is extremely useful. And we have teams. Like if you think of teams that you might go get a job with, there are teams that only do Python. There are teams that only write in JavaScript, right? They do Node.js. And there's teams that only do Golang. So they're only writing in Go because the whole team writes in Go. But I bet you every one of those teams probably has a Bash script somewhere, right? So, and I bet you their CI tool has one-line Bash commands, right? I say Bash, but I really mean shell commands. So if you haven't learned that yet, don't bother, I would say, with the harder languages first. I would focus on one, and that would be shell programming. So I would get, the original version of, the original version of Kubernetes was Bash. So you can do a lot in a shell language, and you can get tutorials and, entire courses on it. So I would do that, because once you start to get into programming and you start to learn Python, Golang, JavaScript, your knowledge kind of carries over a little bit from one to the other. The most important part in DevOps, even if you're just on the ops side, is understanding package managers and their basic functionality. So I may not know how to write JavaScript, but I would expect someone that works with me to know what NPM is. That's the installation tool for installing all the dependencies, mostly for Node, but also now for other languages. So I would expect them to know some basic NPM commands. I would also expect them to know what Maven is, which is a common tool used in the Java world. They may not be an expert in these things, but they at least have a basic understanding that if I look at a Docker file for Python, that I know how Python installs dependencies, right? I know what file to go look for those dependencies. And so a lot of DevOps people may not really ever spend time in raw source code writing languages, but they do have a cursory knowledge of how to read a little bit of it, and maybe they figure out, if I'm in Python, I know where the common Python, if I'm running Django or I'm trying to think of like common toolkits, there'll be common files, right? So like there's a certain config file over here that's always used in Ruby, and there's a certain file over here that's always, those has the npm packages in it, right? And these are all files that you will constantly run into over and over and over again. So I actually find that more useful for junior DevOps people than for them to be like an expert in Python, right? Because now they're a little more diverse, and I know that they can probably write a good Docker file for that Python app or for that Ruby app, because they have some basic understanding of how the things are structured. So I would say focus first maybe on the bash, and then also just deploying some apps and understanding the basics of how that app works. And you can probably just do like a tutorial in Ruby on how to use Rails and make a Rails project, a really basic one, and then go use a Go language web front end and make a very basic web app in Golang. And so the important takeaways there aren't how to write from memory in those languages. It's the package managers, it's how do those applications get used in Git, right? What common directories would you see? In Golang, it builds a binary, whereas you wouldn't necessarily have that in Ruby. So understanding that is even just something that a lot of people may not know. So I would say learning some of that stuff is more important than the language itself. But that's just me. Windows 11, I know nothing about it. I heard that there was a buzz about it today, but I suspect that it will not change anything for Docker. Docker is agnostic of the operating system, so operating systems don't tend to impact Docker's features. Docker Desktop for Windows is already really great with WSL2, so I haven't even looked, but I'm going to guess that WSL2 is going to be around in Windows 11, and we will all use Docker Desktop, and that'll just be that. So that's a guess, but I have no idea. Thank you. Thank you, Rama. I don't know if you're talking to who's awesome, but if it's for me, I appreciate it. If it's someone else, thanks for being a nice person. Do I know any fix to make Docker with PHP faster on Macs? This largely will, I imagine, and it depends on what you mean by faster. Are you talking about installing dependencies or just running it? Because my experience is if you're just running an app, if I'm just running a PHP container, let's say WordPress runs fine on my machine. So I'm on a Mac, I run a WordPress in a container, it runs fine. So I'm not sure. There's a lot of people discussing various potential performance problems if you're bind mounting. So you'll probably need to look at how you bind mount, and maybe you will install packages inside of volume, not on the bind mount, so that the packages don't have to go over that bind mount connection between the host and the guest operating system. So that's usually where people get their problems, is when they bind mount too much stuff into the host operating system and it makes it slow. So I would say only bind mount what you have to bind mount. So that means don't bind mount your databases, keep those in volumes. Maybe you don't bind mount your dependencies, your packages, put all of those in a volume. And then you can nowadays with Visual Studio Code, which is my favorite editor and has great PHP support. So remote containers, you should look at some of these tools for how you might possibly develop with Visual Studio Code, and it may prevent you, it may help you avoid some of the potential delays with all the bind mounts. So look into that, try that out. That's a really neat option. It also allows you to run your container apps on a different machine, but develop locally as if it's all local, which is really great. So all of these remote tools, there's a 2 or 3 different remote tools with Visual Studio Code. And I'll be honest, we're going to probably do a show at some point about GitHub code spaces. But this is my new favorite thing. So I am my limit of 5 code spaces has been reached. So I am forcing myself lately to only use code spaces, which means I never check out source code to my local machine. I'm only using this beta feature of GitHub to essentially, they spin up a VM for me. It's got 8 gig of RAM and a couple of processors. And for each one of these, they spin up a separate VM. And then they'll either give me Visual Studio Code in a browser, which works fantastic, and it works great on my iPad, or I can connect it directly to Visual Studio Code on my desktop. So Visual Studio Code will actually connect directly to that server and use that remotely, and it still looks like a local machine. They give you a URL, a unique URL, and it's wonderfully easy to use. I use it in Safari on an iPad all day the other day. I use it on multiple repos. So you can see like 3 days ago, 6 days ago. So I was doing all this editing, updating a bunch of the source code for my courses, and I never used a local commit. One of the problems is I've started to use multiple machines, right? I've got an M1 Mini, I've got a laptop, and I got an iPad. So now I'm having to manage my source code across all these different machines, and it's a real headache. So I wanted to give code spaces a shot, and it's actually really good. And I'm very excited about the future for this because it's fast. You can run Docker on it. You can set up, you can actually create a .files repo in your own GitHub that will customize exactly how it spins up your code spaces, and you can have it set up ZSH for you if you don't like your default your default shell, and you can customize and install things. You can use a different image to even spin up all the tooling. But it comes with Docker out of the box. It comes with Compose out of the box, and I'm very excited about it. So this changes the speed problem, right? Because now what ends up happening is you're editing natively on a Linux machine where your code is running in the containers. So the biggest problem with Docker on Docker desktop in terms of performance is because of that bind mounting of it mapping the file system across different operating systems. That's the real issue. So if you can find a way around that, I would do it. So +1 for code spaces. All right. I hope that helps, Stefanos. Hope that helps. Rudy says, I use Docker Buildx command because I got an M1 chip Apple machine. Is this the proper way to go from now on? Well, Docker, yes. Docker Buildx, and now the new Docker Space Compose, which will use the new build kit. So Buildx uses build kit. Build kit's been around for 4 years. So it's not new, but one of its features is that you can build for multiple operating systems and then push them all to the same repo at the same time. And you will notice this in my support for Apple Silicon now in all my courses. You will see when you go to Docker Hub and you go to one of my images, let's just look up, whatever. Let's look up this one. So when you look at my image tag, you will now see 3 different operating systems for the same image. So if you're on an Apple M1 and you do a Docker pull Bret Fisher /wordsmith-web, you will get on an M1, you will get the ARM64 version. If you're on an Intel machine, Intel Windows, Intel Mac, you will get this version. If you're on a Raspberry Pi or an older ARM machine, you will get the 32-bit version, and it just works. You don't realize that they're technically built for different architectures in the background. That's the magic of something called the manifest file, which we won't talk about, but it's essentially a JSON file that describes all the different builds. And there's way more than this. If you look up Nginx, Nginx builds for all sorts of architectures, right? There are some that will build for Windows architectures. So if you look up, I think like Python might be one. Or maybe Golang. So if you go look at the tags of Python, that's a bad example. So they might have Windows down here in the list. Yeah. So on this one, latest, so they've got Windows here as well. And we've got some old stuff like 386, we've got mainframes, we got PowerPC, we got all sorts of stuff in here. So these are different architectures that are technically separate images, right? They're their own image manifest with a bunch of layers that are all bundled together inside this repo so that it automatically figures out which platform you're on and pulls the correct image, right? This has all happened forever in Docker for many years. And Buildx is now an easier way, Docker Buildx is an easier way now to build for multiple architectures at the same time. There are many other benefits to Buildx, but really what Buildx is it's just the future of Docker build. If you installed, I think today, in fact, if you installed Docker Desktop from scratch, I think it enables BuildKit by default now for Docker build. Somebody let me know in chat if that's true. I think that's true. So if you just type Docker build, it will already use BuildKit in the background. It'll use the BuildKit. And the BuildKit is what's providing all this magic, right? So yes, that's a great question, Rudy. And the answer is yes. Is it safe to use databases with Docker? Telmo, yes, absolutely. I think at this point, all my clients use databases. Large companies, small companies, they may use databases in containers only for test and then in production. Like I will always recommend you use the cloud provided databases. They're always going to be better at running databases than we are. They already provide backups and failover, and they automatically do version updates, and they provide security and logging and all the things that you need in deploying a database that you don't get out of the box by doing it yourself. So in production, I will always recommend use someone else's databases. A cloud makes them for you because it's hard. But it's safe to use databases in containers if you know how to run databases, because containers are really just applications running on the host operating system that are constrained to a certain amount of resources and access stuff. So it's not like it's running in a VM inside a VM. It's just running natively on that machine, but it has limits. Do you have a video on how to handle production env files? Say I don't have a video on that. .env files, I don't see them used a lot in production. I tend to find them for local development only. So I wouldn't recommend that be your process in production. Typically, you're going to want to inject a different method, right? And so my understanding of .envs, and tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of .envs are really designed for easy local development use, not designed for configuring production systems. I might be wrong on that, but that's my understanding. I see very few teams using that method. In fact, I can't remember the last time I saw one using that method in production. We usually bring them in through environment variables directly or through configuration files that are more in the native language of that app. So a certain format, maybe it's YAML, something like that, right? Maybe it's JSON. It just depends on the app and what its native configuration format is. But that's a good question. Someone else in chat might have a better answer. Let me catch up on chat here real quick. Yeah, I don't think often about gravestones, but I might put that on a gravestone if I. It's not what you know; it's what you share, which is basically what my job is now, right? But yeah, in teams, the people I value the most in teams for decades now has always been the one who wants to do the lunch and learn, the one that wants to go to the conference, and then we'll send them. But when they come back, they've got to provide training for some of the stuff they did, right? At least a couple of lunch and learns or a couple of videos they make for the team so we can all learn some of what they learned, right? Those are the people that are valuable. And if you start looking into the DevOps mindset and look into the DevOps books, right? Go back and read some of the DevOps, like the DevOps handbook and Accelerate and some of these things. It's really about teams sharing And if you yourself become the first person to share, it tends to be a little infectious. So if your team isn't into sharing, you become that person on your own without being asked, and you provide better documentation, make more wiki articles for the team, make some lunch and learns where you create open source and put it on GitHub, and then you teach the team about it. When I see teams doing that, it's infectious. People want to, there's a little bit of competitive nature in that as well, right? If someone else is doing all this stuff and you're not, you might feel like in order to keep up, you might need to do some of that. So you can sometimes change behavior in a good way by leading by example. So. How is DevOps integrated into 5G in the telecom world? I don't know. I've never worked in telecom with infrastructure. At least, maybe not never, but I don't remember if I've ever done it. So I don't actually have a good answer to that. Sorry. Do a lot of people use Traefik? Yes. Traefik is quite popular, especially in small teams where they need an easier to use tool that's not as complicated as maybe some of the other tools that wrap around Envoy or whatever. I enjoy using Traefik more than I do Nginx. However, with Traefik, it is a free tool that lends to a paid tool. So you might find eventually that it has some features that you wish it had that you need to pay for. But that's true of Nginx and a lot of these other tools as well. So just be wary of that. When you tend to want to use it, for example, in Swarm, if you want to use it in a large cluster in Swarm as the single ingress traffic, right? It's doing all the let's encrypt, it's automatically getting certificates, it's doing all this fancy stuff. And you also want it to be fault tolerant, where it has its own central database of configuration and you've got multiple Traefik instances. That's the kind of scenario where you're probably going to need to pay them for it. I don't think it's a terrible amount of money. I don't actually know the pricing, but in those kind of cases, I would be willing to pay for something in an enterprise if it's giving me that much benefit. So the same is true of Nginx and a lot of these other companies. So check that out. Let's see. All right, we're coming to the end of the hour. Let's see if we can find a few more good questions. Justin says, I learned Vim more than anything, get really comfortable with the terminal. It is a good idea to know how to get out of Vim, because a lot of people know how to get into Vim. But remembering the colon Q, it's always a good idea. Yeah, on my build server, I use Docker build. Like Biker's talking about, like that used to be the way, and if that might work, I don't know if it'll. I tend to find that when you install Docker on Linux, it won't enable build kit out of the box, whereas Docker Desktop may do a lot of this for you, right? Something that you'll notice on all of my open source now. So in my GitHub, all of my open source is now trying to be an example of how to use GitHub Actions. So if you just went in to GitHub Bret Fisher and you just went to one of my repositories, if it makes a sample app or an example, of course, the top three right here are not examples because they don't actually build anything. They don't build images or provide stuff like that. But this Bret.run is sort of it's a dumping ground for a whole lot of utilities. The Swarm visualizer, let's just go look at that. So that builds an image that runs a Swarm visualizer. And now what I have in here are GitHub workflows. They all use BuildKit and the latest things that I can find. They use linting. They automatically build the image for 3 different architectures. They use caching, which is important when you want to speed up your builds one after the other. If you want to build it many times a day, you don't want it to have to build from scratch each time. I'm also pushing all my images now, not just to Docker Hub, but also to GitHub's container registry, GHCR. So you will notice now on a lot of my repos that provide images, you'll see this option where you can click on the package, and that will show you if you maybe run into the free limits on Docker Hub for pulling, for example. GitHub does not have those limits yet, although I imagine that someday they probably will if they get popular enough. And so now you can pull this image from here as well as from Docker Hub. And you can also see how to pull different architectures if you needed to hard code it. Anyway, so now these multiple options exist, and I've done this across dozens of repos and images. So that's the work that we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 months to get ready for Apple Silicon and to finally support ARM devices like Graviton instances in AWS or Raspberry Pis. All right, a couple more questions. I've been part of a technical interview for DevOps positions. What should I look for? So this is the opposite question. Great question, Philip. Great question. What should you look for? Do they share? Do they share with the team? Do they share in their GitHub? So turn it around, the exact opposite from my answer before, right? If they're not sharing what they know or sharing what they learn, they may not be super valuable. My throat's starting to act up because I've been talking too long. So I would do that. And then also I might ask them some questions about networking. I think that everyone underestimates the amount of networking knowledge you have to be really good in any developer or DevOps job. So I would ask them about TCP routing, subnets, stuff like that. Because it's one thing to know like the latest, coolest Kubernetes tool, but to understand how a packet actually gets from one Kubernetes node to another. Like, what is the average size of a TCP packet? What's the default? Little questions like that it's not so much to stump them, but it's to understand, does someone really understand all the tech all the way down, or they just have a cursory knowledge of some of the higher levels? And that's fine if you can get away more with that if you're on the developer side of DevOps. But the more you get on the ops side, the more of the systems and the networking you're going to have to know. Did I just say it runs fine on my machine? I don't know. Probably. All right. Let's see if there's any last questions we can do. Secrets management in Docker or K8s. Use the built-in tools until you can't. When you have a dozen clusters, it's hard to use the built-in tools, and you'll probably need to use AWS secrets, or you might use something like Vault, or you might, I've been kind of toying around with the idea of using 1Password, which a project of mine was looking at using 1Password, and it's not quite there yet, but it's pretty close to being able to use 1Password, which I'm a huge fan of that. But using it to actually store credentials that go into Kubernetes, because Kubernetes, there's now a plugin you can get, a controller that will pull them out of 1Password. And if your developers already know how to use 1Password, if that's how you're keeping secrets between the teams and the humans, it might be a thing that you could look at for the machines. But I haven't used that in production yet, so I can't really recommend it. There's also sealed secrets, which is an interesting way of storing your secrets in GitHub securely. There's that. So there's lots of options. I would say use the simplest thing that the internet in general says is secure. So, if you got one Kubernetes or two Kubernetes clusters, just put them in Kubernetes. But you'll usually end up needing another tool as well. And that's when you might have to use like the cloud secret provider or something like 1Password. I try to shy away from telling everybody, just go run Vault, because it's complex and now you have to run it and now you have to maintain it. And that's a lot of work. So I tend to avoid that as long as possible. Network engineering at the highest levels. read and memorize TCP/IP books. Go get Cisco certifications. I don't. I used to work in networking. I had my Cisco cert. I used to be a firewall admin for 120 network sites, and so I managed all the switches and firewalls and routers and stuff. And that was like 20 years ago. So I don't really claim to be a modern day networking expert, but so I won't really have good answers for you. But you know, Cisco certifications, cloud certifications, because clouds do networking. So, all right. Thanks so much, by the way, for all these great questions. I'm running out of time and I'm running out of my voice. So, what about my Kubernetes course? Will you add lessons about Helm, security, Ant, etc.? Yes, those are all planned. Since we just got finished with this big update for all the images to now work, the next step is we're going through and updating any outdated videos. So the Kubernetes Mastery course is going to get updated to 121. Docker Mastery will get updated to the latest versions of Docker and latest Docker Compose features. And so that's going to happen. And then I'm going to start adding new videos to those courses. Absolutely. And I apologize for the delay on that. Those should have been added last year. But due to COVID and just the craziness of the world, things didn't happen as fast as they should have. So those will be happening for sure. I'm not quitting these courses. They are both a daily activity for me and my team. So we work on them often. Sorry if I'm missing some of your questions. I'm just kind of getting through them quickly so we can, because I'm running out of time here. Are there any official documents which regulate security? I don't know. Does anyone have any answers to that? I would look up, what's it called? The first thing I would run if you're running Docker is to run Docker Bench. Look up Docker Bench. It's a tool that will look at how Docker is installed to make sure that you're conforming to recommended standards. If you are in Kubernetes, the Kubernetes ecosystem has at least one tool for that, that comes from the Kubernetes project. And I cannot remember the name of it. So those exist. I'm not sure if they necessarily follow NIST or not, but I don't remember those off the top of my head. When should you use multi-clusters versus many namespaces? There's no right or wrong reason. It's really just, it's like an opinion, really. I like to do both, but I don't really have a strong opinion. I see it done all different ways all the time. So, yeah. Thank you so much for taking the course, everyone. Those of you that are here from the courses, I appreciate it. Appreciate you showing up. All right, everyone. I'm losing my voice again, which happens because of allergies, and we are definitely at time. So I'm going to call it. I'm going to be back here again next week. So I have no planned guests. We're working on some guests for the rest of the year, but no guests yet. So I might come back with some GitHub stuff, might come back with some code spaces, or maybe Docker examples or something like that. You can find out by just showing up on Patreon, by the way. Just go to my patreon.com/Bret Fisher, sign up for free, click follow, and you'll know what I'm going to do on Thursdays, because I send it out 1 or 2 days before, telling everybody what I'm planning on talking about. All right? Thanks, everyone, for coming. I will see you next week, same time here on YouTube Live. Ciao.